There's been good ones and there's been better ones. Let's put it that way. But invariably, there's always been pearls of wisdom to take home with us. And a comment was made in the previous workshop to me by one of the attendants here that it's amazing how things have kind of coalesced together here in all of our thoughts and process about resilience. And true, yes, workshops have complemented, added to the lectures that have taken place so far. And it's a pleasure to reintroduce Tracy. Trothen is coming forward to give us the second part of her presentation. And I know we're going to get some more pearls of wisdom to pervade our very being as we gather. Tracy.
Thank you, Jamie. That's very, very kind of you. I almost forgot to turn my phone on because someone gave me an app or led me to an app that is one of the best apps I've ever seen. So if you're ever debating the benefits of technology or the detriments, this is a fantastic app. It stays on, it doesn't turn off. And some of us need that. Yes. Okay, this afternoon, we're going to continue our conversation about moral distress or moral injury and take a closer look at spiritual impacts of those injuries, which should be right up your alley, and ask ourselves, what is it that we could look for spiritually with experiences of moral injury? And what can we offer, particularly if you're in positions of leadership in a faith community, or you're simply very interested in spiritual health and well-being. So next slide. Objectives, yes. So the objectives for today, for this afternoon, are to explore how the violation of core values can lead to spiritual distress. So we know that the violation of core values leads to moral distress, but also how it can lead to spiritual distress and what we mean by spiritual distress. And to engage as an example, the spiritual assessment and intervention model, which is known as spiritual aim, using a case. So there are several different spiritual assessment tools out there. Some I find more helpful than others. I like this one because it only has three main components, which are three main spiritual needs that I think you'll probably all be able to relate to in some way or another, and can just help give us some direction and guidance around what we might be asking or reflecting on in terms of how moral distress leads to a failure to meet spiritual needs. And then finally, to consider ways to address moral distress, moral injury, including spiritual resources. Next slide, please. So again, I'll be summarizing what's on the slides. So if you can't see the slides, please don't worry about it. But if the slides are useful to you, please do. So moral distress may also be a soul wound that's characterized by shame, guilt, or regret. It doesn't just stop at being this deep moral wound where we've given up and acted counter to our core values. But because our core values are just that, they're at our core, it also has implications for our soul, if we understand our soul to be that which is our core of our personhood, the core of what we believe, the core of our identities. In extreme cases, as two authors who've done a lot of research on moral distress have said a person's integrity, morality, and or spiritual well-being may no longer be what it once was. I'll say that again. In extreme cases, a person's integrity, morality, and or spiritual well-being may no longer be what it once was. So these are researchers who are writing about moral injury in the context of combat. And basically what they're saying is that the deepest, harshest types of moral injury have a soul wound effect. And that's one way we can understand how deeply affected that we or someone else has been by a moral injury, is if it goes right to the core of who we are, our identity, our sense of being, our sense of connection to the holy. Moral distress can feel like betrayal. And we also need to remember, though, that it is a sign of moral sensitivity, and so can also be a good thing. This is something I want to lift up in this afternoon talk, is that moral distress and moral injury, they aren't just bad things. If we never experienced moral injury, then that would say something pretty frightening about our lack of moral commitment. If it causes us distress to act against our core values, then it says that our core values are of significance to who we are. So there is reason for hope there. Yeah, it's just that with that reason for hope, there's also a lot of pain and angst that goes along with it. Next slide, please. So again, moral distress can become severe enough to cause spiritual struggles. These spiritual struggles can include the questioning of meaning in life, or the question of questioning the existence of God. It can lead to loss of trust in one's faith, fractured relationships, isolation, and damage to our self-worth. All of these things are spiritual concerns. Our self-worth, our sense of who we are in relationship to ourselves, as well as to God and to others, are deeply spiritual issues, as we know. Moral distress, when we act against our core values, can be so wounding that it can threaten to fracture, deeply affect all of these aspects of who we are. A lot of research has been done on spiritual struggles from people in different disciplines, including Kenneth Pargament, who is a psychologist, and he's done a lot of work with teams of researchers looking at the effects of spiritual struggles and violations. And as he and his colleagues say, spiritual struggles often concern problems of human finitude and insufficiency, and can be marked by isolation from God, self, and or others, and involve topics and or questioning that are not perceived as socially acceptable. So again, this problem of shame that we experience, of unconstructive shame, that simply leads to increased isolation because we feel so confused, ashamed of what we've done, that we've acted against what we believe in at our very core, those values of possibly caring for others, of integrity, of whatever it is that's most important to us, of social justice. When we act against those things, again, our whole identities get thrown up in the air. Who are we? Who am I if I am not acting in accordance with those things that are most important to me, regardless of the reasons for that? And because it is such a shaming, I know I said this earlier, but because it's such a shaming thing to act against our core values, then we become more and more self-isolating. Because who do we want to tell that to? Often we don't even want to tell it to ourselves. So when we can't come to grips with that, even in our own self, about what I've done or what I haven't done, then everything shuts down. And you can see where the fracturing of relationship happens. And that fracturing of relationship with God too. I don't want God to see me, even though we know we are seen. We are seen always. And that can lead to even a deeper shame, unless we become more visible, unless we are intentional about naming what's really going on, figuring it out, and connecting with others. And that takes courage. It takes moral courage. We're going to talk more about that. So it's not just the moral courage of standing up for your principles in a certain situation. It's also the moral courage that involves coming forward to others about, I did not stand up to my values here. Because the longer we remain isolated, the more isolated we get, the more angry we get, the more alone we can get unconstructively. So questions of identity and one's purpose in life may become overwhelming. So who am I if I'm not able to stand up for those things that I think are most important, are my strongest, most central values? If I think social justice is core to life, and I fail to take voice when I witness an act of social injustice, then that can be pretty hard to deal with. And the truth is, as we heard again about yesterday, that we are all human and we do make mistakes. And sometimes we don't do what we would like to do in case of being our best self. So what do we do with that? How do we respond to that? Well, one way that we respond is too often that our core spiritual needs are not met. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at spiritual assessment. Now, I know that some people really have a lot of concern about spiritual assessment because it feels like it's this linear scale thing that's going to evaluate something that's much more robust, and it's our narrative and it's who we are. But some spiritual assessment tools are about tools that can help us, that are designed to help us to encounter each other with more intentionality, to hear our stories better and more fully, instead of trying to narrow and restrict. Now, of course, a lot of this does depend on how we use any tool, but let's explore this a bit. So spiritual assessment, as Alison Kestenbaum says, who is one of the creators of spiritual aim, spiritual assessment is not a scripted or generic set of questions asked in the same way of each patient, or in our case, person. Spiritual assessment is an evolving dialogue established within a compassionate encounter regarding those issues that most concern that patient. Spiritual assessment involves diagnosing an individual's primary unmet spiritual need and devising a plan. Diagnosing is an important word that I think we've left up to other healthcare professionals too much. Instead of embracing it and making it more robust within the context of theology or faith communities, the ability to identify something like moral injury and also spiritual assessment. The words that we use can rightly or wrongly add credibility to the work that we do in faith communities. So to be not only adding credibility, but also by giving a name to something, we're able to see that something significant has happened. When we experience moral injury, it's not just that we're having a bad day. It's not just that we're emotionally upset. It is those things, but it is also that a core piece of our identities has been compromised, that we have compromised something deeply held within us, either again for external factors or for those internal factors. And sometimes it's when we're more aware that we had a role in compromising those core values, that it wasn't all out there because all the staff weren't available or all the money wasn't available or whatever it was, that I had a role in it, that I have some kind of culpability, that could be even harder. Well, we don't have to grapple with helplessness as much, maybe because you could say, well, I could have done this differently. The fact that we can recognize if we have a role means we need to confess, right? And own it. And that's a hard thing when it's something that we don't want to be part of us. And yet we all have these experiences. We're not perfect. We are not without flaw. And yet we can begin to understand ourselves as being complete, as being created in the image of God. So we're back to that question of what is perfection again. Spiritual distress. Let me give you a simple definition of spiritual distress. Spiritual distress is when we have results from having unmet spiritual needs. Doesn't always, but if the unmet spiritual needs are deep enough, prolonged enough, that will lead to spiritual distress. So when we experience moral injury, our spiritual needs can become a lot harder to address and to meet. And just think about the symptoms of moral injury: isolation, shame, anger, fragmentation, voicelessness, guilt, sense of betrayal, and so on. If we're experiencing all those symptoms that go along with the moral injury, then how able are we going to be to meet our core spiritual needs? And I say core again because I'm talking about the spiritual needs that are most central to us as human beings. Next slide, please. So spiritual aim was developed in the early 1990s by a CPE supervisor in the US. And it is a means to identify, assess, and respond to spiritual needs, particularly during a person's health crisis, but can be used in any circumstance. Next slide, please. And the way that spiritual aim defines spirituality is in a way that's similar to a lot of definitions of spirituality that are out there now, including the 2009 only consensus statement that we have associated with the World Health Organization in palliative care, actually. And if you're familiar with that definition, you'll see that there are parallels, connections to this definition. And if you're not, it's just, I think, enough to know that these are themes that appear in other tools that have been, and definitions that have been embraced by many people. So spirituality and spiritual aim is defined as encompassing the dimension of life that affects the needs to seek meaning and direction, to find self-worth and to belong to community, and to love and be loved, which is often facilitated through seeking reconciliation when relationships are broken. So we're going to consider how these three core spiritual needs impact the conversation about moral distress. It can help us understand some of the spiritual ramifications of what it means to our spiritualities potentially to experience moral injury. Next slide, please. So this is a summary, again, of the core spiritual needs that I mentioned. I'm going to say them one more time. The first one is we need, and this is true for all of us, a sense of meaning and direction. We need a sense of self-worth and belonging to community. And we need to love and be loved, meaning we need reconciliation. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those three core spiritual needs. Next slide. So spiritual aim posits that when individuals face any crisis, one of the three primary spiritual needs surfaces in a clear and immediate manner. So when we're in crisis, our spiritual needs become more visible, and one of them surfaces more prominently. It doesn't mean that we don't always have these needs. The theory is that all of us have these needs in different ways and that they're met or not met to varying degrees at different times in our lives. But when we're in the midst of a crisis, that veil becomes thinner between what it is that we yearn for and how those yearnings are being met or not being met within us and around us. And when we're in a crisis, it's easier for someone who is a spiritual leader, a spiritual guide, to be able to help us in theory, to see what those needs are and to help us find ways to respond to those needs so that we're not left in a state of spiritual struggle, that we can indeed find ways to meet these spiritual needs. Next slide. So we're going to go through each of these three I have a slide for each one, so they're rather dense slides. And like I said, if you can't read it, it's okay. I'm going to be going through all the points and summarizing them and talking a little bit more about them. So the first core spiritual need, a need for a sense of meaning and direction. And again, we all have these needs at different times. How many of you, if you don't mind, those of you who don't mind raising your hand, have ever had a struggle to find a sense of meaning and direction? Ever had a moment where you've struggled for that? I think pretty well most of us, if not all of us, can say that. I raise my hand too. And often that need surfaces more in response to a crisis in our lives, particularly healthcare crises or big crises around the world like war, death, violence, things that break our hearts and leave us wondering, what is going on here and what is my purpose? What is our purpose in life here? And sometimes it's easier to have clarity around that than others. Some people get clear about the reason, about their purpose, about their meaning and direction when they're in the midst of a crisis. Others of us struggle more. It really depends. We're different people and we vary with that. When we encounter someone who is struggling to meet this need of finding a sense of meaning and direction, we might get a sense of the person being out of touch with their own desires, that we're confused. We can't follow what it is they really, really want when we listen to them. And that's because they're having a struggle with knowing what they really want. They may be prioritizing thinking over feeling. So people who are trying to meet this need for a sense of meaning and direction may be trying to work it out at a rational level. I want to know exactly what my purpose is here, what I should do, what it looks like, what my existential origin is, and where I'm going and what I mean. And that's hard because we can get trapped in trying to work these things out from a thought place. And we might be neglecting that heart place of being in touch with, I feel like I'm here and that I matter and hopefully I'm enough, whatever that looks like for people. So worries about big questions. Who is God? What does God look like? How do I know God? Where is God? Why can't I understand God as mystery? Why are we having all these debates about God? Is there really a God? Is there really a God if God is not a specific entity? What does it mean to think that maybe God is more amorphous and thread throughout our life? Well, maybe that means there isn't a God. These deep, deep questions that, because there's so much mystery in our faith, can take us around and around in circles again and again. And often people struggling with this sense of meaning and direction too are trying to make really big decisions in their lives. And they really want to gather as much information as they possibly can because they realize they don't have the answers. They don't understand the concrete realities. They may speak in terms of metaphors and maybe a lot of different metaphors, so they can be hard to follow. And the reason why they're hard to follow is because they actually really are experiencing being in a fog. So if you as a caregiver experience someone who's making you feel like you're in a fog, that's usually because that person is feeling like they are in a fog. So if you're having difficulty following someone as they talk because they're asking all these questions, they're having difficulty pinning things down, it might be that the biggest need they're struggling with is that need for a sense of meaning and direction. And the role of the spiritual caregiver with someone who is struggling most with this spiritual need is the role of guide. When we struggle most with finding a sense of meaning and direction, we need someone to be our guide, our faith guide, someone to help us distill what the most important questions are and let the other ones go. Someone to help us figure out what our meaning is in life. So doing things like legacy work, where we're able to pass on key messages that we really want to make sure aren't lost when we die. A guide also helps a person to identify their own resources. So you can imagine where that would intersect with experiences of moral distress. What are your resources? What can you do in response to an experience of moral distress when we give up and act against our core values? So the guide surfaces key questions for the person, listens to them, supports, and helps that person to make decisions that they need to make, to find some sense of peace, to be more accepting of loss, to identify what really is their heart's desire. So not just all that flurry of questioning in the head, but what is it that means the most right here? What really counts? And hopefully then a person can eventually walk away with a little more sense of meaning and direction about what is most important to who they are. So again, we're going through these 3 different spiritual needs as a way to say, how might these needs be identified in experiences of moral injury? So how do they intersect? Because you as spiritual guides and spiritual caregivers are people who can help others to wrestle with and be with and make sense of their experiences of moral injury. Because I know that you hear a lot of moral injury stories. Next slide. The second spiritual need is a sense of self-worth and belonging. It may not come as a surprise to you that this need is, in surveys and studies, it's become clear that this is the most common big need that people have when they're suffering from spiritual struggles, the sense of self-worth and belonging. It tends to be the most commonly described, reported one, in contrast to the other 2, which are also very, very important, but this one looms even bigger. And those who struggle to meet the spiritual needs, so you may recognize yourself or people you know in this description, need to learn to love self and to feel worthy, that they're very good at loving God and others, but not themselves. And they've got a mistaken notion that that's a good thing somehow. But the truth is, when we can't love ourselves, we're not that good at loving God or others. We need to love ourselves too, or there's not much we can do. Our resources get minimized. And a person who is struggling with this spiritual need tends to blame themselves, tends to prioritize others at their own expense, tends to think they're responsible for all of the ills of the world, that if things are falling apart, if there's conflict, what did I do? I did something. Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. How can you look at that? And the spiritual caregiver can assess whether or not someone is struggling with this sense of self-worth and belonging by asking themselves, when we talk to that person, do you tend to lose track of the person and get redirected towards other people, including yourself? So when you're providing pastoral care, spiritual care to someone, or when you're just trying to provide a listening ear, do you find that the attention keeps turning back to you? That despite your best efforts to be with that person and offer them support, the conversation keeps coming back to you and how you are, and how wonderful you are, and how thankful they are for how wonderful you are. You know anyone who might do that? So the temptation is to enjoy that validation as a spiritual caregiver, right? And be put on a pedestal. But do you start to experience, when you're sitting with that person, a sense of loneliness or sorrow or sadness? Because usually those dynamics are symptomatic of an inability to, again, love oneself, to know that oneself has needs that need to be met, if one is to be healthy and truly connected to other people and to God? Is there unexpressed or underexpressed grief and sorrow there that is sitting there and is present? So the spiritual caregiver, in response to this spiritual need, needs to take the role of valuer. And in some ways, that's a pretty easy role, except that when someone's really good at not loving themselves, they're also very good at turning it back, the attention, or away from themselves again and again. So to truly help someone to value themselves by valuing them requires listening to them and redirecting them to listen to themselves over and over again, and to normalize their feelings, to realize when they're giving up their space again to you, and to refuse that, to create space gently, compassionately, kindly for them to express sadness, anger. People who have an unmet need for a sense of self-worth and belonging often harbor a lot of unexpressed or underexpressed anger, because anger may take people away from you and may feel like you're not loving them enough. So how do we recover anger? How do we recover anger? Desired outcome, the person articulates their own needs, their own desires, their own fears and other emotions, and reports a greater sense of belonging, prioritizes oneself as much as others, has increased self-worth. You can just imagine how this spiritual need can become very unmet in response to experiences of moral injury. The isolation that moral injury causes with that shame of having acted against our core values fragments us again and again and more, and makes it that much more difficult to have any sense of belonging to any community, because no one really knows me, because I don't want anyone to know me, because I'm too ashamed of who I am, because I've acted against those things that are most important to me. Who would want to know me? So we get this cycle happening here. Next slide, please. The last and final spiritual need is reconciliation, to love and be loved. Well, that sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? Maybe not so much. This is really probably the toughest core spiritual need, I think, to respond to and to help each other with. And I invite you all to think very deeply about how this core spiritual need intersects with moral injury. So in this, for people suffering from this need, self-concern is out of proportion to loving others or God. That's a really hard thing to come to grips with. How do you help someone to come to grips with that? How do you come to grips with it? How do I come to grips with it when it happens, right? When it's all about me and I fail to see other people, I fail to love well, I fail to seek reconciliation because I get very caught up in my own sense of arrogance or being right and never being wrong. What do we do with that? So these people, when we're experiencing this as the most intense spiritual need, tend to express anger and frustration towards others. It could be care providers, it could be family, friends, God, and probably deeply fear losing control. This is a tough one. They're all tough, but I think this is the toughest. And with people struggling with this spiritual need, the role of the spiritual caregiver is to take the role of prophet and truth teller. The importance of reflecting back the alienation of others that you see, holding the person accountable, empathizing with their sadness and the grief that underlines that anger, because sadness, of course, often does masquerade as anger. And by being present and not running away, we demonstrate that we can handle that anger, as does God, and that it needs to be heard, it needs to be aired, it needs to be worked through if we are to have any hope of bridging broken relationships. So confession for someone struggling with this need is very important usually. How do we help someone to confess? And again, if we can't confess ourselves when we need to work on reconciliation, when we need to own our own culpability, if we've transgressed our core values, for example, if we can't do that ourselves, this goes back to the earlier lecture today, then we can't help other people with it. It's going to fall down. And these are tasks that I never find easy, and I find just need more and more work. So desired outcome, the person expresses their grief, confesses their part in the brokenness, seeks and accepts forgiveness, shows their vulnerability and love, and the person sees the impact of their behavior on others. So again, can you do that with yourself, with help? Can I do that? And if we can, then we can help walk with others who are struggling with that. Next slide, please. So just a couple of observations that are probably pretty clear already with using spiritual aim. We never, of course, say out loud what we're doing because a person doesn't need to be lectured when they're working really hard. So this is something that we use as a tool. It's a tool, but it's not an out loud tool. It's a tool that allows us some insight to help people explore, to walk with them, to listen for what they're saying, but also for what they're not saying. And all along with all of this, we need to be crafting and working on that art of self-awareness. What is it that's blocking me potentially from hearing? How am I relating to this person or not relating? All those pieces that get in the way. And that intersects very much with the issue of moral distress, because we all have our own experiences of moral distress. So to sort out what my experience is from somebody else in order to accompany them into the spiritual struggles that accompany moral injury takes ongoing self-awareness work on my part to see where I'm at with my own experiences of moral injury and whether or not I've had a chance to process that or what I can seek out there. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about interventions and things we can do with moral distress. But what I'm working at now is trying to bring together these core spiritual needs with experiences of moral distress and how those core spiritual needs can be affected very deeply by experiences of moral distress. Next slide. So Joshua T. Morris, who I quoted earlier today, has done a lot of research in the area of moral distress, moral injury, and he was the one who said that he wants us to use the term moral injury more instead of just saying moral distress is reserved for hospitals and other situations, whereas moral injury is reserved for combat only, because in setting up that divide, we set up an us-them kind of mentality. That means we can't connect. That separates us. So he acknowledges the importance and the significance of the difference of these contexts, but also the commonality and the connection of dynamics of moral injury. And what he wrote very recently that struck me is, as we enter the third year of the pandemic, and the various vaccines and boosters are available, the most urgent task right now in my context as a pediatric hospital chaplain remains sustaining colleagues suffering moral injuries. Now, I think we can take his quote here from him, his words, and extend that to a whole bunch of other contexts, including churches. So if I reword that a bit, as we enter the third year of the pandemic and the various vaccines and boosters are available, the most urgent task right now in my context in the church remains sustaining colleagues suffering moral injuries, colleagues and parishioners. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, here's a case that I've created. It's a very short case, but it may resonate with many of you, I hope. Reverend Shariah is desperate. She has too many parishioners who are buckling under the weight of COVID. Family relationships are hanging by threads. People, including Shariah, are terrified of giving their elderly mother or immune-compromised brother the virus, which they know could kill them, or even looking odd by wearing a mask. But the pressure to go back to normal is unrelenting. Church leaders face pressure to bring people back to the pews, but also to protect vulnerable people. Shariah struggles with confronting ableism, giving compassionate care, prioritizing church survival, and nurturing community. These values seem to be conflicting every day for her. Any of that sound at all familiar to any of you? Little pieces, maybe? These are not normal times, but what is normal? Do we want to go back to normal? If normal is characterized by systemic oppression, racialization, social marginalization of the poor, war, climate change, maybe normal isn't everything. Maybe there's more. But what do we do going forward when really all most of us seem to be longing for lately is just to lose the mask and be together and not have to think about this virus one more time? It's really hard. It's really exhausting. But these issues that Shariah is facing are about moral conflicts, right? What do you do about that pressure to bring people together because you value connection, you value church, you want the church to survive, you're afraid that with people not coming physically to church, that maybe we're hastening its decline, and we want to protect the vulnerable because that's the center of a Christian mandate, is healing and protection of the vulnerable, challenging social injustice. But community is very, very important to it. It's all the way through holy text. So what does community mean? What does that look like? And the models that we know best are those that we have lived, those that seem like they are normal. And we don't have normal anymore. And every day that we have to live in a way that is sacrificing one of these values that is so important to us is a day that we accumulate more moral distress. And that moral distress is often sitting there unresolved and building up into moral residue and that crescendo effect that we talked about this morning, which then leads to these extreme symptoms of isolation, shame, grief, anger, sense of deep betrayal, a sense of worthlessness, no voice. I've heard so many people when they talk about issues, experience moral distress, mention that one, right? No voice. I can't talk. I can't tell anyone. I don't even know for sure what it is I've experienced because I haven't had the words to even diagnose it as moral distress, much less than link it to the spiritual distress and struggle that I feel in response to that. So what do we do? I invite you to think about Shariah's case there and hold it as we go forward through the rest of the slides. And I'd invite you to come back with any insights you might have or thoughts in the question period afterwards regarding, what are those core spiritual needs that she is potentially suffering from not having met in response to these values conflicts, to these moral injuries. So think about that. And if you have any thoughts, please hold on to them. I would love to hear them in a bit. Next slide, please. Reminder of the core spiritual needs, and next slide. Because under normal circumstances, I would have had you split up into small groups and do some brainstorming around this. But since we are in hybrid times and we continue to recreate and try to figure out a new way of being I'll have you hold those good thoughts. So just to start, by way of starting to think a bit about it, up on the slide, I have the 3 core spiritual needs listed, and then some thinking, some initial thoughts about how experiences of moral distress might generate or exacerbate these spiritual needs to the point of them being unmet. So that need for a sense of meaning and direction in the face of moral injury, we may have questioning of moral ideals and core faith values. The breaking of core moral beliefs can shatter our sense of meaning, trust, hope, and faith. The witnessing of the brokenness of society can give rise to bigger questions too for people who are struggling with the sense of meaning and direction. Theodicy struggles have loomed really large, I think, during these pandemic times. And the fact that the pandemic has intersected with war in the Ukraine, with Indigenous grief and justice seeking, and with climate change and economic crises, we are having a convergence of a lot of questions of meaning and direction. And I really do believe that spiritual need for a sense of meaning and direction, we're probably going to see grow larger and deeper in the next number of years. So we can watch for that, and not just watch for it, but figure out how to respond to it in the best way we possibly can. Second, spiritual need of a sense of worth, self-worth, and belonging to community. Experiences of moral injury, again, leave us feeling alone, powerless, ashamed, and angry, question our own self-worth. So it can definitely exacerbate this spiritual struggle around a sense of self-worth and belonging to community. And lastly, that spiritual need to love and be loved for reconciliation. Again, moral injury, one of the key causes that we don't like to talk about, and that I don't hear too many people who do look at issues of moral injury talk about, is our own potential culpability and role in our moral distress. So that it's not just because of external factors beyond our control that we fail to act according to our core values, that more often than not, I think there is an element of a choice here too, of what I'm willing to risk. And sometimes we decide, and in many cases rightly so, that the risks are too steep. In other cases, we're too exhausted, but we're making a choice still. And there is a culpability there. And there is a need to process that. And there is a need, I believe, for confession. And we need to hear people's confession genuinely and not tritely, not to sugarcoat it and say, it's okay, you know, you're so tired, this is so hard, anyone would have done it. But instead to really, really hear a confession before we jump too quickly to absolution, or the absolution just doesn't hold water. Another insight here, when we allow ourselves to be loved and to love, can require courage and insight. And I want to stress this one again, I mentioned already, but self-care is not about individualism. So we throw around the phrase self-care, and it seems like it's just about me. We can't do adequate self-care without engaging other people. And that means working on reconciliation too. That's part of self-care. So self-care is not a nice little happy task. It's a tough one. Next slide. So what to do? Well, first of all, we educate. We name moral distress, we name spiritual distress. We start to understand it. We start to understand the context that it happens in and why. And we start to speak up more, hopefully, when we're experiencing moral tension, when we're seeing values being overlooked, being denied, being contradicted. And we don't speak up alone, because that often isn't the best way. Again, this is not an individual task usually. It's best done in community with others around us. And that's how we can make the deeper and bigger change, I believe, is only through community. And we need safe avenues to address moral distress and to debrief. So first of all, it's that naming. If we don't know what it is we're experiencing, we think, oh, I'm having a bad day and I'm really stressed out. Yes. And there's more, right? When we act against our core values, it has another name, moral distress, moral distress. We're experiencing distress over compromising our core values. We need to know what that looks like. We need to know what our core values are, and we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it and talk about it a lot more. We need to minimize the fear of retribution, shaming, and blaming. We need to have spaces that are safer through our own modeling to talk about these experiences. Next slide. This is a really important slide for all of us in this room, and I think it's a very incomplete slide. I think there's a lot more that we can add, and I'd love to hear your ideas about this when we get into the discussion time shortly. But what resources from your faith, from your spiritualities, may help to address moral injury and then the spiritual struggles that can accompany that moral injury? So there's some theological issues that I've mentioned already, but ownership of sin. We really don't like sin anymore, and we have to be careful how we use sin and what we mean by it. It requires a lot of unpacking, because if it's just about blame, then that's not terribly constructive. But if it is about missing the mark, if it's about messing up, if it's about acting against my core values, we need to address that. Try to make it go away. It doesn't go away. It festers, turns into moral residue, turns into longer lasting moral injury. It doesn't sit well. It's the kind of thing that resurfaces at night when we're alone. Not a nice place to be. And I'm sure we've all had moments when we've been there. Confession. Confession is an incredibly salvific tool and theological conviction. Penance. What do we do? What do we do in response to times when we've done something against our core values? What does penance look like? What does constructive penance look like? What does it look like if the spiritual struggle is around reconciliation with others, and I haven't acted in a way to stand up with my core values and it's hurt somebody else? How do I engage in active reconciliation with them? Looking at confession, seeking forgiveness, but not too quickly. And surrounding ourselves in a conviction that compassion is of vital importance. That is not an easy exercise either, both for ourselves, but also extending to other people. Compassion does not mean ignoring, silencing, or letting us off the hook. Again, compassion goes very nicely hand in hand with sin and confession, I believe. Community, worship. I would really like to see those of you who are involved in leading worship. How many of you here lead worship from time to time? I would so love to see you all have at least one worship service that centers on moral injury, to give people the words, to give them back voice, to name their experience, especially in these pandemic times. So there are many liturgical sources that you can create. They may not be out there yet, but I can well imagine different litanies that could be created around a confession of moral injury. Holy text narratives. Wow. I mean, we've got at least one of you among us who knows an awful lot about lament. We need that. We need that. We need to engage with lament and community and public lament. What does that look like in regard to these experiences of moral injury? What does public lament look like? The preferential for the poor, which I've mentioned several times already, that's a resource from our faith tradition here. So how do we take that mandate to stand with those on the social edges as experiences of moral distress are proliferating even more with the pandemic? How do we see that directive as a resource for developing our own moral courage to stand up, to work on clarity for the values that are most important to us. Now, having clarity about the values that are most important to us does not mean that I have the attitude that I am right and infallible, but it means that I have enough clarity that I want to have the conversation really intentionally with you about what the values are that are informing our choices, our decisions, and what values are falling off the edge here just because we've made assumptions about what's important. So keep thinking, please, about what resources from your faith may be helpful as we go forward. Next slide. Hope. So hope is an ethical issue, as I say often. When we have hope for something, we work towards it. We focus some of our life's energies towards that goal of that hope. When we discuss moral distress openly, when we put a name to it, when we diagnose those experiences of acting against our core values, and when we also, this is my little plug, experience education in ethics, what we're seeing in studies is that education in ethics is an antecedent to moral resilience. We must have education in ethics in order to cultivate moral resilience as well as we can. Because again, if we don't know what values are, if we don't know what our values are, how can we understand something like moral distress? How can we understand that we're acting against our core values or that we fear we are? We need more communication to process what's really going on here. Moral adversity can generate moral resilience. In fact, studies have shown that we must have experiences of moral adversity in order to develop moral resilience. That without those experiences, we don't develop moral resilience. So we need to have our values pushed and stressed, and sometimes we need to have experiences of moral distress where we do act in ways that aren't congruent with our values in order to understand the importance and significance of those values. Now, the only way, though, that that's helpful is if we have the words to be able to debrief and articulate that we didn't act in accordance with a key value, or that someone else didn't, or we didn't in community. We have to be able to have intentional debriefing and intentional reflection on what happened, on what moral distress is and what happened in a given situation. If we are intentional, researchers have found that moral distress may lead to strengthened moral resolve, that I am more convinced, I am clear about my core values. I'm clear what they look like when they're expressed in actions or not. And I'm clear about what the implications of holding these values might be. And I want to have, and I need to have more conversations about that, because it may be too that I'm not understanding your view well enough. But first, we have to get the language about values down. So again, it's just so important to see that there are so many studies, and there are just a few that I've listed up there, that do show that moral resilience does require experiences of moral adversity. So there is something really, really good potentially about these experiences that cause us moral distress, moral injury. If we are deliberate with them and we work through them in community, then we can get greater resolve and clarity and moral courage. You can't have moral courage that's effective without having a clarity around what it is you value morally, why, right? And understand too that our values are dynamic to some degree, that what I valued 20 years ago may not look exactly the same now. Next slide, please. I want to say this again here. It's really, really important. Moral adversity can generate moral resilience, strengthen moral resolve, clear values, and increase moral courage and prudence with intentional reflective work. Next slide. And I want to say this again too, because it's so important. Moral resilience does require ethics knowledge. You can take your knowledge of ethics and take it to your faith communities and have conversations, again, about values. Ask people, what are your 5 core values? Let's have a brainstorming session. Let's talk about why you chose those values that you chose, why you didn't choose others, what your understanding of that value is. Is it the same as mine? How is it different? Again, that education and those conversations are so important. That underlined line there I have, discuss moral distress openly and often. That's a prescription. We need this very, very much, especially now. Next slide. Moral distress is normal. We all experience moral distress from time to time. We need to know our own personal warning signs. This goes back to Andy's talk about authenticity and self-awareness, right? What are your own personal warning signs when you're experiencing moral distress or any distress for that matter? Could be changes to your sleeping and eating. It could be that you're angry, low motivation, wishing people would just go away, disengagement, wanting to walk away from my work and my profession entirely. I'm done. I'm out of here. I can't do this one more time. You hear that phrasing one more time, you've got some kind of distress going on. It might be moral. You have to ask yourself, is this about the compromising of my values, or is it another kind of distress? Seek help. We all need help. Some of us aren't very good at seeking help, especially when we're a helper. Avoid an individualist approach to self-care. It doesn't work. It's not about just playing soft music and lighting a candle and having a bath. That may well be part of it, and that's great. And it's about more than that. Because if I care for myself well, I have to be caring about my relationships with myself, but with others and God as well. So if there's no spillover from those quiet times, then is that really self-care? It might be light self-care. What's deep self-care? Self-care is not an indulgence. It is an ethical imperative. No self-care equals impaired competence and burnout. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Did it not come up? Oh, computer's getting tired. Okay, well, I can tell you. We are almost at the end. This is the second last slide. So I will just tell you then, it's a picture. Oh, there it is. Passion led us here. You're here because you do have passion. There's something you long for. There's spiritual needs that we long for and we seek to fill. There's life needs that we long for and seek to fill. They often dovetail. And there is hope, and there are possibilities, and there are lots of things we can do. And last slide. So how can you imagine addressing moral distress in your faith communities, especially knowing that moral distress often leads to spiritual struggles, unmet spiritual needs, that moral injury does often lead to a soul wound, a struggle for one of these three core spiritual needs, and it's too easy to be left alone with that, since by its very nature, moral injury is isolating. Thank you.
So again, I think it's time to bring up some questions. And Ellen, if you could bring up the microphone, then I will find whoever is speaking on it and pull them in on a camera. And folks online, if you have questions, now's the time. So add to the chat, and I would love to open your mic and let you speak to the whole room if you're willing to do that.
Back here, Stephen.
Thank you.
Wait.
Let's just bring this over here.
There you go.
There we go. Good.
Several questions, but I'll try to put them all into something succinct from your morning presentation to this afternoon. And part of it comes out of a personal experience in February of last year, with my mother making the decision to die through medically assisted and dying. And I wonder if there isn't sort of a natural conflict between our personal core values and those that might be seen professionally or career-wise. And the reason why I asked that is that the primary doctor, when he realized I was a minister, said, how do you wrestle with this, or how do you mitigate this with your role as a minister and what you're experiencing here as a son? How do you deal with that? And so it made me think of him in his position of being a doctor and the medical field primarily looking at cure rather than assisting somebody in that decision. It seems so counterintuitive to what the medical field generally does. So I wonder, is there not a natural conflict that would almost cause us moral injury just because of our personal core beliefs or values and that which is inherent in the profession that we choose? Is that?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and you picked an incredibly important example of MAID. It's interesting because you're right. Often certain professions like ministry gets equated with a particular stance on MAID, usually for most people, I think, being against MAID. But for others, it's actually the opposite. So I'm not sure. It depends what your script is that you've been given, your moral script. So for some people, being a minister, being a faith group leader might actually lead us in the other direction with MAID, but it may really be case specific, right? So compassion can sometimes be the entry point there, or for others, though, it can be a strict moral directive against assisted death, going against what's understood or perceived to be God's time. But yeah, I've met people whose personal views disagree with their church's official doctrine, say in the Roman Catholic Church. We don't have an official doctrine on MAID in the United Church. Again, there tends to be more of a support for basic key principles, I believe anyways, like compassion and social justice. And so it's a little more, maybe it's a little more complex, maybe it's harder to work with. And doctors, like you're saying, medical doctors, I've heard medical doctors often say to me that they're supposed to treat. So that what they've done, some of them, is to redefine assistance in dying as a treatment option, which causes ethicists like myself to have a whole raft of questions around that. Is death a treatment? Is aging a disease too? I mean, there's lots of different pieces there. So yes, if your values, your personal values, conflict with the core values, if I'm understanding you correctly, that are upheld in your profession, then you've got the possibility of conscientious objection, of being torn at the very least in different directions. I ended up co-writing an article with a bioethicist, a friend of mine who is Roman Catholic in a Roman Catholic hospital. And they send people out who request MAID. They refer them elsewhere, or they get ignored. One of the two. They're supposed to make a referral, but for a lot of people, making a referral, a good referral, meaning a referral that will get results that are desired by the person asking for the referral, is seen as morally contradicting and violating their core values too, just the act of a referral. So the moral injury, yes, that is experienced by many people was something as intense, as important as MAID is huge. So there's another example of newer legislation since 2016 that we are having to wrestle with and keeps evolving and getting more and more complicated and emotional and morally loaded. through the pandemic too. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. Is that what you were thinking of? That split between having to embrace or being expected to embrace certain moral values as a professional that might be attached to your profession versus your own personal moral values. It's a response. Oh, thumbs up. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I don't wear my glasses. I was just telling someone else that because when I wear my glasses, since I don't have bifocals, I can't read my paper. So it's this choice between seeing you well and seeing my paper well. So my apologies, caught me. Other thoughts on spiritual distress and moral injury, or just moral injury? Oh, this is such an important topic. You know, have you had experiences of your own come up in your mind as we've had these conversations today? Is there anything that's sitting there occupying space that you'd like to share with us?
So I've got a thought that's occurred to me as I've been playing around with this notion. I love the idea of talking about moral injury in medical terms, because it takes it out of the realm of being personal or blaming or shame or feeling weak. But the other part of the medical model is that it's possible then to start conceiving of moral healing. And you've talked a lot about moral injury, which I really appreciate. I'm wondering what moral healing looks like and what's the church's role in healing? Jesus was known as a healer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, exactly. And I think that you're bang on with that. So what does moral healing look like? Well, maybe it looks a bit like moral resilience and the cultivation of that. Maybe it looks like having conversations that are right out there in the open and naming, like you said, using some of these diagnostic medical terms, even moral distress, giving us a way to understand it that normalizes it, right? And it needs to be normalized because it's something we all experience. So this just makes sense that we need to talk about moral distress, moral injury in a way that elevates that common shared experience and struggle, and that gives words to it. Because it used to just be that, oh, I'm stressed. I'm having I'm having an emotionally stressful time, and I'm having a meltdown, whatever words that you use. But it's something in addition to that when it's moral injury, that there is indeed emotional distress, but there is also moral injury because you've harmed those values that are most important to you, that aren't just most important to you, but that are in you. So it's a core part of yourself. So if we can talk about this and identify and name moral injury as something real that we all do experience and give examples, right? So put some flesh on it and have conversation and help people to name their core values, and then help people to see, well, when do my core values get threatened? When are they endangered? When have I acted against them? What has that felt like? Am I still dealing with some residue from those times? And what can I do with it? Often by putting it out there and by understanding it, having the resources to see that this is an ethics conversation as well as an emotional and spiritual conversation, can, yes, help us to demystify it, to understand it. And simply by doing that and being more deliberate about creating space to process it, we also increase communication. So communication is an essential part of good ethics. Without communication, we can't have a conversation around values. We can't understand that just because I prioritize the value of caring and you prioritize the value of caring, maybe we don't mean the same thing. So how do we listen to people's stories well and do that in community so that we can facilitate good ethics and good understanding of moral injury? So I really like your point, really like the way that you are, raising moral healing in relationship to moral resilience and moral courage, I hear too.
I was thinking too about with healing, with confession and with acknowledgement and some of those things that we have to do in our own space to say to ourselves honestly, and Jesus often said that those were the ways to healing, right? And just gratitude as well, with the leper and that story of what healing is like, right? And you were talking about liturgy and what can we do? And the prayer of confession has been a really interesting spot in a lot of liturgy in church. And just in my colleagues and conversations around, do we even want that anymore? And what does a prayer of confession look like? And I remember talking to Bill years ago about his take was, prayers of confession where we're talking about it, confessing our guilt and confessing our sin, when the biggest problem that we have is that the self-worth and that struggle, are those helpful? And yet, in hearing that some of us are in the space where if we're too stuck on ourselves, we need that sense of openness to our own faults, our prides, but for others, they may want to, what they really need is to know that they're loved. So I think that's a really important part of the liturgy, but boy, that takes a lot of thought and maybe just variety of prayers to try to get to what people need.
Yeah, you're right. And that can feel overwhelming and exhausting too, can't it, Dawn? So we started off our gathering here yesterday looking at the story of the hemorrhaging woman and Jesus calling her to confession, right? Who touched me? And then the blessing and the generosity and the love and the go forward with self-love and upholding of that prioritizing of self-love, as well as the prioritizing of relationship, though. Jesus felt that connection and named it. So how do we engage those biblical stories that are such powerful metaphors and narratives that I think have all kinds of healing potential when we look at moral distress? I think you could probably engage almost any biblical story with moral distress in some way or another. But yes, absolutely, Don, too, coming to grips with the fact that we're in a church community where everybody has some different, more acute spiritual needs surfacing at any given time. It can also feel pretty overwhelming for the minister, for the person in leadership, or the people in leadership, right? And how do we go about empowering others to share that load, to do that in community? We keep talking about that. It's a hard one too, because even doing that also takes energy. So it's, there's no really easy answers to that, but I think that gathering in community like this is certainly a big concrete step. And I'm getting more and more interested in the small concrete steps we can take, because otherwise it's so easy to get overwhelmed with it all, isn't it? Thank you for that. Wonderful connections. Really appreciate that.
A number of, in your talk, you were talking about these kind of moments where we know that we're making decisions that are contrary to our core moral values. I feel like so much of life is that. Walking down the sidewalk, I'm very much aware that even just that very simple gesture is going against my core moral value of valuing in the land of Indigenous people that has been paved over, the land paving over of excellent farming land, the runoff from that sidewalk that then goes into the oily street that then goes into the river system. And every aspect of our society is contrary to my moral, my sense of my moral, my core values. Every food in the grocery store, every car on the road, the air we breathe, all of the interpersonal relationships that are encouraged through the other sort of moral stakeholders out there, like social media. And I don't know if it was you who mentioned before the law and social media and other things that set values for us. So how would you address that from moving from a kind of a sense of like those acute moments of moral conflict to this kind of generalized moral conflict that we live in every day?
Thank you for that. Again, it's such a fine distinction in some ways, but there's that distinction between a values conflict where my values aren't the same as other people's. And I'm up against that, and I see the results of it daily, like you so eloquently said, with your powerful list of examples, and moral distress. So a values conflict would be when my values don't line up with or are contrary to someone else's, the government's, or whatever choices are made around me. Moral distress, moral injury occurs when I make a decision to act against my moral values. So we experience values conflicts, like you said, every day. Every day I look at the world and I despair. What are we doing with war, right? But I don't have an easy answer to that. But what are we doing? But I experience a sense of conflict and a sense of emotional distress. But it's when I do engage in an action or behavior or decision that goes against my core values of social justice, of caring for others, that generates moral injury in me. It's not confronting what others around me are doing as much. That creates a different kind of distress that is very important. But it's when I knowingly act against what I hold to be most valuable to me. When I act in a way that does not uphold the well-being of other people, because all of a sudden I've prioritized myself out of arrogance or greed or self-interest or exhaustion or whatever it is. You can have all kinds of reasons and excuses. Bottom line, when I do that, I act against my core value of caring for others. And then I have to live with that because I've made that call. So there's a distinction there. It's a complicated distinction, but there is a distinction between experiencing, like you said, that generalized values conflict, just by virtue of living in the world that we're in, and the moral injury or distress that results from when you make decisions that are against, contrary to the values that you hold. Does that make sense? I know it can be a little complicated.
Just your last little explanation there has helped me understand sort of as the moral distress or injury as the church. We've generally had a shared core value about what's really important and what our meaning, if it's the number core value about our meaning and purpose, is to gather in community, to be close, to care for each other, to share the peace, touching, the whole power of touch and healing. All these things have been central to what it is to be the church. And we've had this period of time of like, no, if you're really loving, you will not touch anybody. You won't be close. You're going to stay away. You maybe continue to stay home, and you're going to sit far apart from everybody. So it's like, wow, I can't even wrap my head around this. Like, what is our purpose? Who are we? And so it's sort of like, it's kind of feeling is, to me, going back to normal would be, where we can embrace and live out those core values again. But it's like, maybe not, is this going to be a permanent thing where we're never going to hug each other again? Even seeing old friends here, it's like, what do we do? Like hip? No, we can't do a hip bump. A fist. Oh, well, So I wonder, I hold out hope that one day we'll have that kind of normal, but who knows?
Yeah, you raise a good point. There have been an awful lot of losses, and there continue to be an awful lot of losses. And when we make decisions around gathering in person, do we mask or not mask? And if we do mask, then maybe we're aligning more with a core value of community because we can see each other and connect even more deeply. But if we don't mask, maybe we're really undermining that core value of protecting the most vulnerable among us. So we're caught in a lot of situations lately where we're violating our core values by making one decision and not another, and there seems little way around it. So all the more reason for us to have these conversations, I think, about moral distress injury right now, so that by having the words and the language, the ability to name these examples, that we can start to take back some of the power, healthy power around it, and maybe become more deliberate in our decision making and acknowledge when we can't meet our core values perfectly, what it means to be imperfect in that journey in meeting those core values, and how we can do it together more deliberately, and even when we do not have perfect agreement. Yeah.
I'm holding the mic, so I have the pleasure of asking a question. I just a couple of comments. First, thank you so much for both sessions today. Not only opening us up to such an integral aspect of our lives, but also our lives together. I really appreciated your emphasis on self-care as being in community. It was just a brilliant connection and a redefinition that I think is imperative. I want to come back to this discussion of confession because one of the things that I teach frequently is liturgy and worship. And I think it's a really important question. I was thinking about the spiritual fast, the Eucharistic fast that many Anglicans underwent during COVID. And I was thinking in particular of the prayer, we have done those things we ought not to have done and left undone the things that we ought to have done, which actually speaks to me very much of what you're talking about today, and how important and integral confession is to their understanding of worship as Eucharistic as well, that it would be anathema not to confess, not to name those things, in fact. And I understand the shame that some people feel when words are put into their mouths about the things they've done wrong and that kind of thing. But actually, it is the step that brings out from the shadows into the light the things that isolate us. And the language of sin very often is the things that distance us from God, each other, and our true selves. So I'm making that connection in what you're saying today. And the last thing that is that normally in United Church liturgies, where you have a prayer of confession, you have an assurance of pardon. And I wonder if we might actually put the assurance before the confession. That is, sort of say to people, God loves you and God's grace is there at all times. Now let us say the things that are hard about our brokenness and about the distance between us.
I really like that myself. Thank you, Andy. That's very powerfully put, and I think does tie back to your conversation reflections on authenticity and perfection too, and confessing what it means to be human. So if being human is part of our confession, then it's something that we share and we all know. And maybe there's some comfort and support and encouragement there too. It's so sad, I think, that confession has received such a bad rap, because without honest confession, we can't get that honest absolution. So what if we start with the assurance part and do confession and then have another assurance? We do need encouragement and support, and we are fragile creatures. I recognize that. And yet, if there's no space, if there's only deafening silence around the things that I do wrong, then no one wants to really listen to me. And I'm left voiceless and alone again, and I have to keep harboring what I did, how I acted against what I consider most important. And when I can't put that out there, then it is more and more deeply shaming and isolating, and not in a constructive sense. So how do we reconnect? And I really appreciate those ideas. Thank you.
And I wonder if we can even push the notion of confession one step further, because we've limited confession to saying the things that we've done wrong. But really the root of the word is to say the truth. We confess our faith as well as our sin. And I think sometimes we need to confess our faith, and we need to confess being sinned against, and we need to tell the truth. And telling the truth is maybe one of the stages towards moral healing. So maybe we need all of those different kinds of confession in our liturgies and not just a confession of our own personal sin or even of our corporate sin.
Oh, I like that. I think that's important. I think it's, when we can engage in communal conversation about our diverse truths, then we can learn more and understand better. So enhance communication by listening to those narratives. Thank you.
We are coming to the top of the hour. I wonder whether there's time for one more question. And then I think there's somebody who's set up to say thanks to Tracy, but I want to confess that it's 5 o'clock.
I don't have a question. Since it is the top of the hour, mighty big thanks. This has been so wonderful to experience your expertise in the area, your ongoing learning in the area. Thank you for confessing to that.
Thank you.
And yes, it's the top of the hour, time for supper, wherever you'd like to have supper. Apparently there's a gathering at a Thai restaurant somewhere. Some people know about that. I got to go find a TV and find out how the Yankees are doing. Yes, yeah, because it was rained out. Anyhow, thank you, Tracy. And we will see everybody later on when Andy comes at 7:30. 7:30. Have a good nourishing supper time.
So friends online, that draws to a close our afternoon. We're going to take a break now for 2.5 hours. It's 5 o'clock here in Ontario. We're joining back in again at 7:30, which is 2.5 hours from now. And I hope you'll come back to hear Andy's next lecture then. Enjoy your break. Bye for now.